The moment she ordered that bridge torn down, she signed something she didn't even know existed. The first hit sounded like a hollow crack that echoed across the creek, sharp and wrong, like a piece of quiet being broken instead of wood. And I remember the smell first. Diesel drifting low over damp earth, mixing with that wet, old timber scent that only shows up after a long winter. I stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets, watching the excavator's bucket press down on the railing like it was nothing more than scrap, while Denise Hallbrook stood 10 feet away in her cream blazer, chin slightly lifted, clipboard tucked against her side like a badge of authority she never earned. She didn't even look at me when she gave the signal. That was the part one noticed. Not anger, not hesitation, just certainty. Like she believed this moment had been hers for weeks, maybe months. Around us, a few neighbors had gathered at the edge of the gravel, quiet in that way people get when they know they're watching something they might talk about later but don't fully understand yet. One of the contractors paused, wiped his hands on his jeans, and asked her again, "You sure this is approved?" And she gave him that tight smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, and said, "It's not county property. It's a violation. Remove it." That word hung there. Violation. Like she'd already decided the ending before the story even started. I didn't say anything. I didn't step forward. I didn't try to stop them. Instead, I pulled my phone out slowly and started recording, steady, level, capturing everything. The machine, the angle of the bucket, the exact moment the first plank gave way and dropped into the shallow water below with a dull splash that sent ripples across the surface. The bridge had always sounded different under weight, a soft creak every time I drove across it, like it was reminding you it was there. Now it sounded like it was being erased. Denise finally glanced at me. Just once, like she expected a reaction, something loud, something she could push back against, but all she got was me standing still, watching, documenting. That seemed to irritate her more than anything. She turned away quickly, already moving on, already thinking this was finished. But it wasn't. Not even close. Because what she saw as a cleanup was actually the moment everything shifted. I could feel it even then, standing in that cold morning air, the kind that sticks to your skin. I wasn't angry anymore. Not really. That had passed somewhere between the first notice she taped to my mailbox and the second letter threatening fines. What I felt now was something quieter, something precise, because I'd already seen something she hadn't. Weeks earlier, buried in a set of old documents left behind in my uncle's garage, folded into a worn envelope that smelled like dust and time, there was a map. Not a simple one. A county plat, marked with lines most people would ignore, codes most people wouldn't recognize. I didn't understand it at first either, but I knew enough to know it didn't match what she was claiming. And when that railing cracked under the weight of her decision, I realized she'd just crossed from assumption into liability. The excavator backed up, repositioned, and took another section down, cleaner this time, faster, like the hesitation was gone now that the first piece had fallen. One of the neighbors muttered something about it looking different already, like removing it made the place feel open, but all I could think about was how permanent that action was. You can argue over a letter. You can dispute a fine, but you can't undo removal. You can't pretend something wasn't touched once it's gone. Denise checked something off on her clipboard, satisfied, already stepping away before the job was even fully finished. That was her mistake. She thought authority ended at the edge of the neighborhood. She thought lines on her HOA map meant more than lines on a county record. And as the last section of railing tilted and slipped into the creek, I lowered my phone just slightly, already knowing that by the time she understood what that bridge actually was, it wouldn't be me standing there explaining it. It would be someone she couldn't talk over. I bought the house at the very end of the road because nobody else wanted it, and the first thing every realtor said was the same line, like they were reading from a script. That little wooden bridge might be an issue someday. I remember standing there during the showing, boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt by the creek, listening to that faint trickle of water under the boards, and thinking it sounded more like a feature than a problem. The place sat on just under half an acre, nothing fancy, a single story with peeling paint and a mailbox that leaned a few degrees too far to the left, but it was quiet in a way that felt earned. No through traffic, no streetlights blasting through your windows at night, just the hum of insects and the occasional engine in the distance. The bridge was the only way in from the main cul-de-sac, a narrow span of weathered planks with metal rails that had been patched more than once, and it creaked every time I drove my truck across it. Not like it was failing, but like it was reminding you that it had been there longer than anything else around it. My uncle used to own the place before me, and he never talked much about paperwork, but he kept everything, every receipt, every permit, every odd little diagram folded into envelopes that were labeled in his handwriting. When I moved in, I spent a whole weekend sorting through boxes in the garage, breathing in dust and old paper, trying to piece together what had been done to the property over the years. That was when I first saw the map, the one that did not match what anyone in the neighborhood seemed to believe. It was not obvious at first glance. Just lines, measurements, markings that looked like they belonged to engineers, not homeowners. But there was a section along the creek, a strip that did not fall cleanly into my lot, and right where the bridge sat, there was a notation I could not ignore. I did not fully understand it that day, but I recognized enough to know it was not private in the way Denise kept insisting. Still, I did not go around announcing that. Around here, information travels faster than truth, and the last thing I needed was a confrontation before I knew exactly what I was dealing with. The HOA had already made its presence known before the bridge ever came up. A letter about the color of my trash bins. Another about my truck being parked too far into the driveway. Small things, technical things, the kind that seem harmless until they start stacking. Denise never introduced herself like a neighbor. She showed up like an inspection. The first time she walked up to my porch, she did not ask how I was settling in. She pointed at the bridge and asked if I had permits for it. I told her it had been there longer than I had. She said that did not matter. That answer told me everything I needed to know about how she operated. It was not about facts. It was about control. So I kept my answers short, my tone even, and my eyes open. I started paying attention to how often she referenced authority without ever naming where it actually came from. She would say things like policy requires or the board has decided, but never once did she mention county records or easements or anything that existed outside her little circle. That gap stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, the letters escalated. Warnings turned into deadlines, deadlines into threats of fines, and every notice circled back to the same target, that bridge. She called it unsafe, unauthorized, a liability waiting to happen. What she never did was verify it. And that was the part that made me slow down instead of react. Because if she had taken even one step outside her assumptions, she would have found what I found in that garage. Instead, she kept pushing forward, building a case that only existed inside her own rules. By the time she taped the final notice to my mailbox, the one that gave me 72 hours to remove what she called a violation, I had already made my decision. I was not going to argue with her. I was not going to rush to prove anything. I was going to let her follow that certainty all the way to the point where it could not be undone. And standing there that morning, listening to the last pieces of that bridge drop into the creek, I knew she had just reached it. Denise did not come back that afternoon, and that told me more than anything she could have said, because people like her do not linger once they believe they have already won. They move on to the next thing that needs correcting, the next person that needs reminding. And by the time the sound of the excavator faded and the last truck rolled out, all that was left was the creek. Running under open air where the bridge used to sit, quiet again like nothing had happened. Except now there was a gap where something used to be solid, and every time the wind moved across it, you could hear the difference. I stood there for a few minutes after everyone left, not to admire the damage, not to dwell on it, but to fix the details in my head, the angle of the cut beams, the position of the remaining posts, the way the soil had been disturbed on both sides where the equipment had crossed. Details matter when something turns from a disagreement into a record. I walked back to the house slowly, boots picking up that damp dirt, and once I was inside, I set my phone on the kitchen counter and let the video play all the way through without touching it. Every second was there, clean, steady, no interruptions, no missing pieces. The question from the contractor, her answer, the exact moment the first section gave way. I watched it twice, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to be sure there was nothing left to chance. Then I turned it off and went back out to the garage. The air in there still held that dry, paper smell, mixed with old motor oil and sawdust, the kind of scent that does not change no matter how many years pass. The box with my uncle's documents was exactly where I had left it, lid slightly bent at the corner, edges worn soft from being opened and closed too many times. I pulled out the envelope again, the one with the county markings, and laid the map flat across the workbench, smoothing it out with both hands. Under the overhead light, the lines were clearer than I remembered: property boundaries, elevation notes, drainage paths, and right there along the creek, the section that had caught my attention before. I traced it slowly with my finger, following the thin line that cut across what everyone in the neighborhood assumed was private space, and I stopped at the notation again, the one tied to a maintenance access designation that did not belong to any homeowner. That was the piece Denise had never looked for. That was the piece that changed everything. I reached for my laptop, pulled up the county records site, and started matching what I had in front of me with what was officially filed. Parcel numbers, easement references, archived maintenance logs. It took time, but each entry lined up tighter than the last. There it was, listed in plain language if you knew where to look: a designated access structure associated with stormwater management, maintained under county authority, not subject to private modification without approval. I leaned back slightly, letting that settle, not as a surprise, but as confirmation. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires crunching over gravel, and for a second I imagined what it must look like now from the road. That empty span where the bridge used to be, like a missing tooth in an otherwise neat row of houses. To most people, it would just look like something removed. To me, it looked like a line crossed. I printed the documents I needed, each page sliding out warm, stacking neatly beside the map, and I organized them in a simple order: original plat, current record, notation references, nothing complicated, just clear, direct, impossible to misread. I did not rush. There was no reason to. Denise had already done the part that could not be undone. All that was left was to decide how and when to let the rest of it unfold. And as I stood there in that quiet garage, the hum of the printer fading into stillness, I realized something that made me almost smile, not because it was funny, but because it was precise. She thought she had removed a problem. What she had actually done was create one that did not belong to me anymore. The next morning, the neighborhood looked exactly the same from a distance: clean driveways, trimmed lawns, flags hanging still in the early light. But the moment you got closer, you could feel something was off, like a detail had been erased that people had not fully registered yet. I made coffee, black, let it sit for a minute while I stood by the window facing the creek, watching the thin layer of fog lift off the water where the bridge used to be, and for the first time since I moved in, there was nothing connecting the two sides except air. The absence was louder than the structure had ever been. I took a slow sip, set the mug down, and checked the stack of documents on the kitchen table again. Not because anything had changed, but because repetition has a way of sharpening focus. The county plat, the easement reference, the maintenance designation, each page told the same story from a different angle, and none of them included the HOA. That was the gap Denise had built her authority around, the assumption that if something sat inside the neighborhood, it belonged to the neighborhood. But land does not work like that, and neither does responsibility. Around 9 o'clock, I heard a car roll up and stop near the edge of the gravel where the bridge used to be. Tires crunched, a door opened, and then a second one. I stepped outside and saw Harold Benton standing there with his hands on his hips, looking down at the creek like he was trying to remember something that had just slipped out of reach. He turned when he saw me and shook his head slowly, not angry, just confused. He said he had lived here long enough to remember when county trucks used to come out after heavy rain, checking the flow, tightening bolts, replacing boards when they got too worn. He said it had been years, maybe more than a decade, but he was sure of it. I nodded, not surprised, just letting him say it out loud, because sometimes memory carries more weight when someone else hears it. He asked me if I was going to rebuild it. I told him not yet. He looked back at the empty span again, then at me, and I could see the question forming, not about the bridge, but about why I was so calm. I did not answer that one. Around 10:30, Denise arrived. Same car, same controlled posture, same clipboard, but there was something slightly different in the way she stepped out this time, like she was expecting to manage a follow-up rather than declare a victory. She walked straight toward me, heels steady on the gravel, and stopped a few feet away, just outside what she probably considered her professional distance. She did not ask how I was. She did not acknowledge what had been there before. She went straight to procedure. She said the removal had been completed and that I would be receiving a notice outlining the cost recovery and any additional compliance requirements moving forward. Her voice was even, rehearsed, like she had already said it in her head more than once. I let her finish. Then I asked her one question, simple, clear, the kind that does not sound like a challenge unless you know what it carries. I asked her if she had verified ownership before authorizing the removal. She paused, just for a fraction of a second, and then she answered with confidence, saying the structure was within the community and therefore under HOA jurisdiction. That was the moment I knew she had not checked anything beyond her own rules. I nodded once, not arguing, not correcting, just acknowledging what she believed. She took that as agreement, made a note on her clipboard, and told me I had a set number of days to comply with any further directives that might be issued. Then she turned and walked back to her car, already moving on again, already convinced this was just another resolved case. I watched her drive away, the sound of her engine fading down the road, and then I looked back at the creek, at the open gap where the bridge used to be, and for a brief second, everything was completely still. No machines, no voices, no movement, just water slipping past rocks like it always had. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and scrolled to the number I had saved the night before, the one tied to the county office that handled stormwater and infrastructure records. My thumb hovered there for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I understood exactly what would happen once that call connected. Then I pressed it, lifted the phone to my ear, and waited as it started to ring. The line clicked once, then a second time, and a calm voice answered with the kind of tone you only hear from people who deal in facts, not opinions, and I introduced myself without rushing, gave my address, described the location along the creek, and then I chose my words carefully, because there is a difference between complaining and reporting something that matters. I said a structure that appears on a county plat as part of a drainage access point had been removed, and I could hear the shift on the other end, not dramatic, just a subtle change in attention, like a file being opened somewhere I could not see. The woman asked me to repeat the location, asked if I had any documentation, and I told her I did, more than enough, and that I could email everything within the hour. She did not interrupt, did not question my intent, just confirmed an address and gave me a direct line along with a case reference number that sounded routine, but carried more weight than anything Denise had put on paper. When the call ended, the quiet in the house felt different, not empty, but set in motion. I sat at the table, opened my laptop, and began attaching the files one by one, naming each clearly, plat map, easement reference, maintenance designation, and finally the video. I watched the upload bar move steadily across the screen, each percentage point a step further away from this being a private dispute and closer to it becoming something official. Outside, the day had warmed slightly, sunlight cutting through the trees and catching the surface of the creek where the bridge used to cast a shadow, and for a moment it looked almost normal again, like the land was trying to reset itself. Around noon, a notification came through confirming receipt, along with a short message that an inspector would review the materials and follow up. There was no urgency in the wording, but there did not need to be. Systems like that do not rush. They proceed. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence settle again, and then I heard it, faint at first, the low murmur of voices carrying from the road. I stepped outside and saw two neighbors standing near the edge of the gap, pointing, talking in that cautious way people do when they are not sure if they should be involved. One of them glanced over at me and gave a small nod, like he was acknowledging something without saying it out loud. News does not take long to move through a place like this, even without anyone officially saying a word. Denise had made sure of that with her letters and her visits, but information moves differently when it is not controlled. By early afternoon, I saw her car again, pulling up slower this time, not with the same sharp confidence as before. She stepped out, looked toward the creek, and for the first time, she did not go straight into speaking. She just stood there for a second, taking in the absence, like she was trying to measure something she could not quite define. Then she turned to me and asked if I had reconsidered rebuilding the structure under proper approval. The phrasing was careful, more careful than before, and I could tell she was adjusting, not because she knew the truth, but because something no longer felt as certain as it had the day before. I told her I had already contacted the appropriate authority to clarify jurisdiction. That was all I said. I did not explain further. I did not show her the documents. I did not need to. She held my gaze for a moment, then gave a slight nod, like she was filing that information away, and wrote something down on her clipboard again, slower this time. When she left, she did not look back. I watched her car disappear down the road, and then I looked at the open space over the creek, the sunlight hitting the water at just the right angle, and I knew the next time someone came out here, it would not be to enforce a neighborhood rule. It would be to answer a question she never thought to ask. The next day did not start with noise. It started with stillness, the kind that feels deliberate, like something is waiting just outside your line of sight. And I noticed it before I even stepped outside, standing there with my hand on the door handle, listening for the usual rhythm of the neighborhood, distant engines, someone closing a garage, a dog barking somewhere down the block. But instead there was a pause in it all, subtle, almost easy to miss. Except I had been paying attention long enough to know when something shifted. When I opened the door, the air felt cooler than it should have for that time of morning, carrying that faint damp scent from the creek. And as I walked toward the edge where the bridge used to be, I saw them before they saw me, 2 county trucks parked along the gravel, plain white, no flashing lights, just official in a way that did not need decoration. A man in a reflective vest stood near the bank, looking down at the water, while another person, a woman with a tablet in hand, was taking slow steps along the edge, scanning, measuring, documenting without saying much. They were not in a hurry. That was the first thing that stood out. This was not a reaction. This was a process. I stopped a few feet back, giving them space, and waited until the man glanced up and noticed me. He nodded once, professional, neutral, and asked if I was the one who made the report. I told him I was. He asked if I had additional documentation beyond what I had sent, and I said yes, that I could bring it out. He said that would be helpful. No judgment, no assumptions, just information moving in a straight line. I went back inside, grabbed the folder I had prepared, and when I returned, the woman had crouched near what used to be the base of the structure, pointing at something on her screen while the man took a photo of the exposed footing, what was left of it anyway. I handed him the documents, and he flipped through them carefully, not rushing, stopping at the plat map longer than the others, tracing the same line I had traced the night before. He asked me if anyone from the HOA had contacted the county prior to the removal. I told him not to my knowledge. He nodded slightly, like that answer fit into a larger pattern he had seen before. Then he asked me to walk him through exactly what had happened, and I did, step by step, the notice, the deadline, the contractor, the question that had been asked, the answer Denise gave, and the fact that no verification had been presented at any point. He listened without interrupting, occasionally glancing toward the creek, matching my words to the scene in front of him. When I finished, he thanked me, not in a casual way, but in a way that acknowledged the clarity of the timeline. The woman stood up, brushed her hands together lightly, and said they would be documenting this as an unauthorized removal of a county-designated access structure pending full verification, and that further contact would come from their office once the internal review was completed. The words were measured, precise, and even though she said pending, there was a weight behind it that did not leave much room for interpretation. As they continued working, I noticed a few more neighbors gathering at a distance, not close enough to interfere, but close enough to see that this was no longer just a neighborhood issue. No one spoke loudly. No one asked questions. They just watched. About 20 minutes later, another car pulled up, not a county vehicle this time, but Denise's. She stepped out slower than usual, her eyes moving immediately to the trucks, then to the people working near the creek, and finally to me. For a brief moment, she did not move at all. Then she walked forward, each step more measured than the last, and approached the man with the documents in his hand. She introduced herself, stated her position, and began explaining that the structure had been removed due to safety concerns under HOA authority. The man listened, the same way he had listened to me, without interruption, without reaction, and when she finished, he asked one question, simple, direct, the kind that does not leave space to maneuver. He asked her to provide the authorization confirming the HOA had jurisdiction over that specific structure. There was a pause, longer this time, and I could see it happen, not loudly, not dramatically, just a slight shift in her expression, like something she had relied on was no longer holding the same weight. She began to answer, referencing community guidelines, internal decisions, but the words did not land the same way they had the day before. The man nodded once, made a note, and thanked her for the information. No confrontation, No raised voices, just a record being built in real time. And as I stood there, listening to the quiet return between each exchange, I realized this was the moment where control changed hands, not through argument, not through force, but through something much harder to ignore, a system that did not need to believe her to prove her wrong. Denise did not stay long after that question, and that was the part that settled it more than anything she could have said, because people who are certain do not leave early. They stay, they press, they try to regain ground. But she stepped back, gave a tight nod, and said she would follow up with documentation, her voice still controlled, but missing that sharp edge it had the day before. The county inspector did not react, did not challenge her, just wrote something down and continued walking the perimeter, measuring distances, taking photos, marking points along the creek with a small flag that stood out bright against the damp soil. It was methodical, almost quiet work, but every movement carried weight, like each note and each image was being placed into something much larger than what any of us could see from where we stood. Denise lingered near her car for a moment after that, flipping through her clipboard, scanning pages like the answer might suddenly appear if she looked hard enough. But then she closed it, got in, and drove off without another word. The sound of her car faded quickly, replaced again by that low, steady flow of water under the open span. The inspectors stayed another half hour, maybe more, and before they left, the woman with the tablet walked over to me and said that based on initial review, the structure aligned with a recorded county maintenance access point tied to stormwater infrastructure, and that any removal without authorization would trigger a formal review. She did not say what that meant in full, but she did not need to. The phrasing was clear enough to understand where this was going. She thanked me for providing the documents and said someone from the department would be in contact soon. Then they packed up, climbed into their trucks, and drove off, leaving the neighborhood quieter than it had been all week. For a while, no one moved. The neighbors who had gathered slowly drifted back toward their homes, conversations low, cautious, like they were recalibrating something they thought they understood. Harold stayed a little longer, standing beside me with his arms crossed, looking out at the creek. He let out a slow breath and said he had a feeling about that bridge, that it never quite fit the way Denise described it. I nodded, not needing to add anything, because at that point, the facts were no longer just mine. They were starting to belong to everyone who had watched this unfold. The afternoon passed without interruption, the kind of still stretch that comes after something shifts but before the full impact arrives. I went back inside, sat at the table, and reviewed the documents again, not to check for errors, but to think ahead, because once something becomes official, it does not stay contained. It moves through channels, through offices, through people who are trained to follow a process all the way to its conclusion. Around 4 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. I answered, and the voice on the other end introduced herself as being from the county department, referencing the case number I had been given. She confirmed they had reviewed the submitted materials and the site inspection notes, and she said they were opening a formal inquiry into the unauthorized removal of a county-designated structure. The words were steady, neutral, but they landed with a kind of finality that could not be walked back. She asked if I would be available to provide a recorded statement if needed, and I told her I would. She thanked me again and said they would be reaching out to all involved parties for documentation and clarification. When the call ended, I set the phone down slowly and looked out the window toward the creek again, the late afternoon light stretching long across the ground, touching the edges of where the bridge used to be. For the first time since Denise had stepped onto my property with that clipboard, I did not feel like I was part of a dispute. I felt like I had handed something off to a system that did not rely on assumptions or authority that could be declared out loud. And somewhere down the road, whether she realized it yet or not, Denise was about to learn that the line she crossed was not one she could redraw. By the next morning, the neighborhood had stopped pretending nothing had happened, and you could feel it in the way people slowed down when they passed the end of the road, like they were trying to take in more than just what they could see, because the absence of that bridge had turned into something else entirely, something heavier than a missing structure. I stepped outside just after sunrise, the air cool and still, and for a moment it looked almost peaceful again, the creek moving the same way it always had, sunlight catching the surface in thin lines that shifted with the current, but the ground around it told a different story: disturbed soil, uneven edges, the clear imprint of where something had been removed without understanding what it was connected to. I walked closer, stopping at the edge, and listened, not for noise, but for that quiet confirmation that nothing here had changed except the assumption people had built around it. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed again, this time with a number I recognized from the day before. When I answered, the same calm voice came through, but there was a difference now, a slight firmness underneath it, like the situation had moved from review into action. She told me they had completed an initial cross-check with archived maintenance records and infrastructure mapping, and that the structure matched a registered county access point tied to stormwater management, complete with a historical maintenance log that went back further than the subdivision itself. Hearing it said out loud, in that tone, made it real in a way paperwork alone never does. She continued, explaining that they had already reached out to the contractor listed in my video to request documentation on authorization, and that they would be issuing formal notices to all involved parties, including the HOA, requiring immediate clarification and response. I thanked her, kept my voice steady, and when the call ended, I stayed there for a moment, phone still in my hand, looking out at the open space over the creek, understanding that what had started as a neighborhood conflict had fully crossed into something neither Denise nor her board could control anymore. Around noon, a white envelope appeared on my porch, placed neatly against the door, no stamp, hand-delivered. I picked it up, already knowing where it came from before I even opened it. Inside was a notice from the HOA, formal language, references to compliance, cost recovery for the removal, and a warning about additional penalties if I failed to respond within a specified time frame. The wording was more rigid than before, like it was trying to reinforce authority that was already starting to slip. I read it once, folded it back along the same crease, and set it on the table without reacting. The timing told me everything I needed to know. They were moving forward as if nothing had changed, because they did not yet understand that everything had. By early afternoon, another vehicle pulled up near the road, not county this time, not Denise either, but a dark pickup with a company logo on the door, the same contractor from the day before. He stepped out, looked toward the creek, and then toward my house, hesitating for just a second before walking up the path. When he reached the porch, he took off his cap, held it in his hands, and asked if he could speak with me. His tone was different from before, less certain, more careful. He said he had been contacted that morning, that questions had been raised about the authorization for the removal, and he wanted to confirm exactly what had been presented to him before the work began. I told him the same thing I had told the county, that I had not authorized it, that the HOA had directed it, and that no verification of ownership had been shown at any point. He nodded slowly, like he was piecing together something that did not sit right, and then he said he had asked Denise twice that morning if everything was cleared, and she had assured him it was. He looked back toward the creek again, then down at the ground, and I could see it settling in, not panic, not yet, but the realization that he had stepped into something bigger than a routine job. He thanked me for my time, put his cap back on, and walked back to his truck without another word. As he drove off, I noticed a few more neighbors watching from their driveways, the same quiet observation, but now mixed with something else, awareness. The pieces were starting to connect, not just for me, but for everyone who had seen this unfold from the beginning. I went back inside, sat at the table, and looked at the envelope from the HOA again, the clean lines of printed authority sitting next to the stack of county documents that said something entirely different, and I realized the next time those two versions of reality met, one of them was not going to survive it. That evening, the neighborhood meeting notice went out, not by mail this time, but by email and a printed sheet taped to the community board at the entrance, bold letters announcing an emergency session to address compliance issues and recent developments, and I knew exactly what that meant before I even finished reading it. Denise was not backing down. She was doubling down. By 7 o'clock, the small clubhouse at the center of the subdivision was full in that quiet, tense way where people take seats but do not speak much, the air carrying that faint mix of carpet cleaner and old coffee, fluorescent lights humming overhead. I took a chair near the back, not hiding, just observing, the same way I had from the start. Denise stood at the front beside a folding table, her clipboard replaced by a printed agenda, posture straight, expression composed but tighter than usual, like she was holding something in place. She started the meeting with routine language, references to maintaining standards, protecting property values, ensuring safety, but the words felt heavier now, like they were being used to reinforce something that was no longer stable. Then she moved to the main point, the removal of what she described as an unauthorized structure that posed a liability risk, and she spoke with the same certainty she had used at the creek, outlining actions taken, justifying decisions, presenting it as a resolved issue. I watched the room instead of her, the way people shifted in their seats, the way a few exchanged glances, because they had seen the county trucks, they had heard the conversations, and even if they did not know the full picture, they knew this was not as simple as she was making it sound. Then she mentioned cost recovery, that expenses associated with the removal would be assessed accordingly, and I could feel the tension sharpen, because now it was not just about authority, it was about money, about who would carry the weight of a decision that was starting to look uncertain. One of the board members, a man named Richard who usually stayed quiet, leaned slightly toward her and said something under his breath, and she paused for just a second before continuing. But the rhythm was off now, just enough to notice. When she opened the floor for questions, there was a moment of silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to become uncomfortable, and then Harold raised his hand. He did not stand, did not make a speech, he just asked one question, simple and direct, whether the ownership of the structure had been verified with the county before it was removed. The room went still in a different way this time, not confused, but focused. Denise answered quickly, saying the structure was within the community and therefore subject to HOA authority, repeating the same line she had used before, but now it sounded like something practiced rather than something proven. Harold nodded slowly, but he did not look convinced. Then someone else spoke up, a woman from 2 houses down, asking why county inspectors had been at the site that morning if it was purely an HOA matter. That question did not come with an edge, but it carried weight. Denise hesitated, just for a fraction longer than before, then said that outside agencies sometimes review matters related to safety, trying to keep it general, trying to contain it. I could see it in the room then, the shift, subtle but undeniable, people starting to connect what they had seen with what they were being told. I did not speak. I did not need to. The information was already moving without me. Denise moved on quickly, trying to regain control of the agenda, but the focus had already changed. It was no longer about a bridge. It was about whether the authority she claimed actually held up when it was questioned. As the meeting continued, more questions came, not aggressive, but persistent, about process, about verification, about responsibility, and each answer she gave felt slightly thinner than the last, like something being repeated too many times without support behind it. I sat there, hands folded, listening, watching the structure she had built around herself start to show its seams, not collapsing, not yet, but no longer solid. By the time the meeting ended, people did not leave in their usual quick way. They lingered, talking in small groups, voices low but active, the kind of conversation that spreads faster than any official notice. Denise stayed at the front, gathering her papers, speaking quietly with the other board members, her posture still controlled, but there was a tension there now that had not been there before. I walked out into the night air, cooler now, the sky clear above the rooftops, and as I made my way back toward the end of the road, I could hear the creek again, steady, unchanged, moving through the space where the bridge used to be, and I knew that whatever came next was not going to be decided in that room. It was already moving somewhere else. The next morning did not bring noise or confrontation. It brought paperwork, the kind that moves quietly but carries more force than anything said out loud, and I saw it before I even stepped outside, a county vehicle parked further. Down the street this time, not at the creek, not in plain view, but positioned like it belonged there, like it was waiting for something to unfold rather than reacting to it. I walked toward the end of the road slowly, the gravel shifting under my boots, and as I got closer, I could see Denise standing near the edge again, but this time she was not directing anything. She was listening. The same inspector from the day before stood across from her, holding a folder instead of a camera, and the tone between them was different, controlled, formal, without any of the back and forth that had filled the air before. I stayed a few steps back, not hiding, just outside the conversation, close enough to hear the rhythm of it without interrupting. The inspector spoke first, referencing the case number, outlining that the structure removed had been identified as part of a registered county access point tied to stormwater infrastructure, and that its removal without authorization triggered a formal violation review. The words were steady, measured, and each one landed with a kind of weight that did not need emphasis. Denise responded, her voice still composed, explaining that the action had been taken under HOA authority due to safety concerns, that the structure had appeared deteriorated, that the board had acted in the interest of the community. It sounded similar to what she had said before, but here, it did not fill the space the same way. The inspector listened, then asked for documentation supporting jurisdiction, the same question, but this time it was not just part of a conversation, it was part of a record. Denise opened her folder, flipped through a set of printed guidelines, community bylaws, internal notes, and handed over a few pages, her movements precise, controlled, but slower than I had ever seen them. The inspector reviewed them briefly, then looked back up and said that while HOA guidelines may govern aesthetic and community standards, they do not override county-designated infrastructure or easements, and that any action affecting such structures requires prior authorization from the appropriate department. There was a pause then, longer than any before, and I could see it settle in, not all at once, but piece by piece, like something she had relied on was being redefined in real time. Around us, a few neighbors had gathered again, drawn by the presence of the county vehicle, standing at a distance but close enough to understand that this was no longer a discussion, it was an evaluation. The inspector continued, explaining that the removal would require a full assessment of impact, potential restoration, and allocation of responsibility, and that formal notices would be issued outlining the next steps. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The structure of what he was saying carried itself. Denise nodded once, slowly, her expression still controlled but no longer certain, and said she would cooperate fully and provide any additional documentation requested. It was the first time she had used that word, cooperate, and it changed the tone of everything. The inspector acknowledged her response, made a note, and then turned slightly, scanning the area one more time before closing the folder. The conversation ended without conflict, without escalation, just a clear shift from assumption to accountability. Denise remained there for a moment after he stepped away, looking out over the creek, the open span where the bridge used to be, and for the first time since this started, she did not speak. She just stood there, taking in the absence, not as something she had controlled, but as something that had consequences attached to it. I turned and walked back toward the house, the sound of the creek steady behind me, and as I reached the porch, I heard a car door close and an engine start, softer this time, less certain. Inside, the stack of documents was still on the table, unchanged, but the weight of them had shifted. What had started as information was now part of a process that had its own direction, its own pace, and its own outcome. And somewhere in that process, beyond the notices and the reviews and the quiet conversations happening in offices I would never see, the reality Denise had been building was beginning to come apart, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with something far more difficult to ignore, the simple, documented truth of what that bridge had always been. The notice arrived just before noon, not by email, not quietly, but in a marked county envelope placed directly on Denise's front porch and another copy delivered to the HOA mailbox at the clubhouse, and by the time I stepped outside, word had already started to move through the neighborhood in that low, steady way that does not need confirmation to spread. I did not go looking for it, but I saw it anyway, Denise standing at the edge of her driveway, envelope in hand, reading it once, then again, her posture still straight, but no longer composed in the way it had been before. There was no clipboard this time, no immediate response, just silence and paper, and that contrast said more than anything else could have. I walked down toward the end of the road, not in a hurry, just following the same path I had taken every morning since this started, the gravel familiar under my boots, the creek visible ahead through the gap where the bridge used to be. When I reached the edge, the county inspector was already there again, along with another person I had not seen before, older, carrying a thicker folder, the kind that does not get brought out unless something has moved beyond initial review. They were speaking quietly, going over notes, referencing documents, and when Denise approached, the conversation shifted, not louder, but more formal, like everything that followed would be recorded whether it was written down or not. The inspector acknowledged her, confirmed receipt of the notice, and began outlining the findings, not as opinions, not as interpretations, but as established facts tied to documentation, mapping, and historical records. He stated clearly that the structure removed had been verified as a county-maintained access point connected to stormwater infrastructure, that no authorization had been issued for its removal, and that the action taken constituted an unauthorized interference with county property. The language was precise, and each word carried the kind of weight that does not need repetition. Denise listened, her expression controlled but no longer certain, and when she responded, her voice was measured, explaining again that the decision had been made under HOA authority, based on visible deterioration and perceived risk, but even as she spoke, it was clear that the ground under that argument had shifted. The second official opened his folder and referenced additional documentation, including maintenance logs and recorded easements that predated the neighborhood itself, placing the structure firmly outside HOA jurisdiction. There was no confrontation in his tone, just clarity, the kind that leaves very little room for interpretation. Around us, more neighbors had gathered, not speaking, not interrupting, but present, witnessing. Something that had moved beyond internal rules into something defined by a larger system. The inspector then explained the next steps, that the county would require a full restoration assessment, that responsibility for costs would be determined through the formal process, and that all parties involved, including the HOA and any contracted entities, would be required to provide documentation and statements. Denise nodded slowly, once, absorbing it, and for the first time since I had met her, she did not try to redirect the conversation, did not assert control over it. She simply acknowledged what was being said. The shift was not dramatic, it was quiet, but it was complete. The authority she had been operating under no longer applied in the same way, and everyone standing there could feel it. The officials concluded the discussion without escalation, noting that further communication would follow through official channels, and then they stepped away, continuing their documentation along the creek, as if the outcome was already moving forward without needing anything more from the moment. Denise remained where she was for a few seconds after they turned, looking out over the open span, the absence that had started this whole sequence, and there was something different in the way she stood there now, not defeated, not yet, but aware. I turned back toward the house, the sound of the creek steady behind me, and as I walked, I realized that nothing about this needed to be argued anymore. It had already been decided, not by volume, not by position, but by something much harder to challenge, a record that existed long before any of us stood here, waiting to be acknowledged. The days that followed did not feel like a resolution. They felt like a tightening, like everything that had been set in motion was now pulling itself into alignment, and you could see it in the way the neighborhood moved, quieter, more observant, as if people were waiting for something to land. I started noticing small changes first, not announcements, not anything official posted where everyone could read it, but shifts in behavior. Denise no longer walking the street with the same pace, no more clipboard under her arm, no more stopping at driveways to point out violations that suddenly seemed smaller than they had a week ago. Instead, there were envelopes, more of them, arriving at different houses, not all at once, but enough to create a pattern. People would step outside, open them, read, then look down the street toward the creek without saying anything. It did not take long for the details to surface, not through gossip, but through fragments of conversation that carried just far enough. The county had issued formal findings. The removal had been classified as unauthorized interference with designated infrastructure. Restoration was not optional. It was required. And the cost, the part that no one says out loud at first, was not small. I was at the edge of the property that afternoon when Harold walked over, holding a folded letter in his hand. He did not open it again. He had already read it enough times, but he told me what it said in a way that made it clear he understood the weight of it. The HOA had been notified that they would be responsible for coordinating restoration under county supervision, and that failure to comply would lead to additional enforcement measures. He let out a slow breath, looked toward the creek, and said he had never seen anything like this happen here before. I nodded, because neither had I, but I had seen enough to know how it would unfold from here. Later that day, I saw the contractor return again, not to work, but to meet with a county representative. They stood near the same spot where the bridge had been, going over documents, pointing at the ground, discussing measurements, timelines, specifications, all of it structured, all of it moving forward without any input from the HOA beyond what was required. Denise arrived midway through that conversation, but she did not step into the center of it. She stayed just off to the side, listening, occasionally speaking when asked, her tone careful, measured, like every word now had to pass through something before it was said. There was no sign of the authority she had carried before. No declarations, no assumptions, just responses. The county representative explained the restoration plan in clear terms, materials that would meet current standards, structural requirements, inspection checkpoints, and the expectation that the final result would match or exceed the original function. It was not framed as a punishment. It was framed as a correction. That was what made it heavier. There was no anger in it, no confrontation, just a process that did not bend once it started. Over the next few days, equipment returned, but this time it was different. No rush, no abrupt action, just measured work, surveying, marking, preparing the ground for something that would be built the right way, under the right authority. Neighbors watched again, but the tone had changed. There was no curiosity now, only understanding. This was not a project. This was a consequence. I stayed out of it, not because I did not care, but because there was nothing left for me to do. I had already done the part that mattered. The rest belonged to a system that did not need my voice to move forward. One evening, as the sun dropped low and cast long shadows across the creek, I saw Denise standing there alone, looking at the marked outlines where the new structure would go. She did not have anything in her hands. No papers, no clipboard, just stillness. She stood there for a long moment, then turned and walked back toward her house without looking at anyone. I watched her go, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just with a kind of clarity that had been building since the first day she stepped onto my property. What had happened here was not loud. It did not explode. It unfolded, step by step, until there was nothing left to argue. And standing there in that quiet, with the sound of water moving steadily through the space where the bridge would soon return, I understood something simple and final. The authority she believed in had never been real in the way she used it, but the consequences of acting on it were very real, and now they belonged to her. The first time I drove across the new bridge, it did not creak the way the old one did, and that was the first thing I noticed, not the fresh wood, not the clean steel rails catching the morning light, but the absence of that familiar sound that had been there every single day since I moved in, like a quiet reminder under my tires that I was crossing something older than the neighborhood itself. Now it was smooth, solid, engineered to a standard that did not leave room for doubt, and as my truck rolled over it, there was no hesitation, no give, just a steady, grounded movement from one side of the creek to the other. I slowed down halfway across and glanced to the right, watching the water move underneath, clearer now where the banks had been reshaped, the edges reinforced, everything aligned the way it was always supposed to be, but had been ignored for years. The county markers were still there, small and unobtrusive, placed near the edge where most people would never notice them unless they were looking for them. I noticed them. I always had. When I pulled into my driveway, I shut the engine off and sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, listening to the silence settle back in around the house. It felt different now, not quieter, but settled, like something unresolved had finally been put back into place. Over the past few weeks, the neighborhood had adjusted in ways no one had announced. The letters stopped. The inspections stopped. The small, constant pressure that had once come from one direction simply disappeared, not replaced by anything new, just gone. The HOA meetings still happened, but they were shorter, less certain. The tone changed in a way that did not need to be explained. Denise was still there, still part of the board, but she was not the same presence anymore. She spoke less, listened more, and when she did say something, it carried a different kind of weight, not authority, but awareness. I saw her one evening near the mailbox, standing alone with a small stack of papers in her hands, and for a brief second, our eyes met. There was no confrontation in it, no tension, just a quiet recognition of what had happened and what it had changed. She gave a slight nod, almost automatic, and then looked away, turning back toward her house without another word. That was enough. I did not need anything else from her. The system had already said what needed to be said. Harold came by later that week, walking across the new bridge slower than necessary, just to feel it under his feet, and he let out a low whistle when he reached my side, shaking his head in a way that mixed disbelief with something close to respect. He said he had lived here long enough to think he understood how things worked, and then this happened. I told him that sometimes things only look simple until someone checks the right line on the map. He laughed quietly at that, but there was truth in it, the kind that does not need to be explained further. As the days passed, the bridge stopped being a topic and returned to being what it was always meant to be, just a way across, something you use without thinking about it, something that does its job without asking for attention. And that was the final shift, the one that mattered most. It was no longer a symbol of conflict or control. It was just infrastructure, functioning exactly as it was designed to. One morning, as I stood at the edge of it with a cup of coffee in my hand, watching the light move across the water, I thought back to the moment Denise had stood in the same place, convinced she was removing a problem, convinced she understood what belonged to her and what did not. She had been so certain, so sure that authority was something you could declare and enforce without ever verifying it. But standing there now, with the sound of water moving steadily beneath a structure that had been rebuilt under the right authority, I understood something she had learned the hard way. You can control a neighborhood. You can write rules and send letters and enforce standards. But you cannot claim something that was never yours to begin with. And you definitely cannot remove it without consequence. She thought she was tearing down my bridge. In the end, she only exposed the limits of her own authority.